He said I was overreacting, that asking about my own money was disrespectful to the man who put a roof over my head. But when he pushed me down the stairs, there was no misunderstanding his message. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't a moment of heat. It was punishment for daring to question where my savings had gone. I lay there on the hardwood floor, wind knocked out of me, ribs screaming, and something shifted inside. Not just pain, not just betrayal, something deeper, something colder. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to Marcus, official hospital stationery. He left it unopened on his desk, like he always did with things that didn't require immediate applause. I opened it, and what I read nearly made me gasp. I didn't say a word. This is not a story about revenge in the Hollywood sense. I didn't poison him. I didn't burn the house down. I didn't even scream. But I did make a decision. A quiet one. The kind that changes everything. If you've ever been silenced, manipulated, or made to feel small for simply wanting answers, you may want to stay for this. Before we continue, please subscribe. The morning it happened, everything felt painfully ordinary. The kettle was whistling, toast just beginning to brown, and I was standing barefoot in the kitchen flipping through the household ledger I wasn't supposed to touch. Marcus had always handled the finances, a fact he reminded me of constantly, usually with a smirk, sometimes with silence. But lately, something had felt off. The savings account I'd had before we married, the one I'd watched slowly grow through years of steady work and careful budgeting, had been dwindling. I'd asked once, casually, over dinner. He'd changed the subject. I asked again that morning, a little more firmly. And that's when he looked up from his coffee with that flicker of disdain in his eyes. The one that always appeared just before he reminded me who held the power. "What savings?" he said flatly, not even pretending confusion. I held the printed statement in my hand, the one I'd quietly requested from the bank. "This one," I replied, laying it on the table between us. He didn't look down. He just stood, slow and deliberate, and said something I'll never forget. "You're digging in places that don't belong to you, Elise. You should stop." I wish I could say I was brave, that I pushed back with all the fury building in my chest. But I didn't. I just asked a question. Simple, direct, trembling only slightly. "Why is it nearly empty?" That was all it took. He moved so fast, I didn't even have time to brace. 1 second, I was standing at the top of the staircase holding a bank printout. The next, I was airborne. My back hit the railing, then the wall, then nothing but air until the final thud. My shoulder hitting the last step before my hips slammed into the polished wood floor. I couldn't scream. All I could do was lay there, blinking at the ceiling, trying to remember how to breathe. Marcus didn't rush down after me. He stood at the top, looking down, chest heaving. "That'll teach you," he muttered before disappearing into his study and closing the door. That door didn't open again for hours. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't even call for help. I just laid there until the pain dulled enough to crawl to the couch. Every movement screamed, every breath ached, but my mind was louder than my body. He had pushed me, on purpose, because I asked about my money. Something inside me cracked, not just a rib, something deeper. Later that night, as I sat in the dim bathroom pressing frozen peas to my shoulder, I looked at my reflection and said nothing. But I made a vow. I wouldn't leave just yet, because now I needed answers. And when I got them, I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to run. I was going to wait. And I was going to make him regret thinking I was weak. 2 mornings later, the envelope arrived. I heard the mail slot click shut as I stood in the kitchen, gently massaging arnica cream into the bruises on my upper arm. The skin was a canvas of sickening greens and purples now, a violent signature of the man I'd once believed would protect me. I moved slowly, deliberately, still sore from the fall. When I bent to pick up the mail, it slid out in a neat fan. Bills, a grocery store flyer, and one thick envelope with Marcus's name typed in bold across the front. The return address made me still. St. Joseph's Oncology Department. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a long time, my heart knocking softly against my ribs. I knew I should leave it on his desk. I knew what the right thing was. Ethically, legally, whatever standard people like Marcus used to measure morality. But the right thing had already betrayed me. I had done everything the right way. I had asked, waited, endured, and he had pushed me down a flight of stairs. So I slid the envelope into my robe pocket and walked away from the mail pile like nothing had changed, even though everything had. Later that afternoon, when he stepped out for one of his power lunches, meetings where I wasn't welcome, I retreated to the guest room where he rarely bothered to go. I sat on the edge of the bed, drew the curtains, and opened the envelope with steady hands. The words were clinical, unapologetic, tumor progression, stage 3, further testing required. I read every line twice, then 3 times. There was a treatment plan, a recommendation to begin chemotherapy immediately. The words bled into each other, cold and unfeeling, but the impact was blindingly human. Marcus had cancer, and he didn't know I knew. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the back of a shoebox under the guest bed. Then I sat still for a long time, not out of fear or shock, but calculation. He had hurt me, and not just with his hands. He had chipped away at my spirit for years, with condescension masked as charm and control masquerading as concern. But this diagnosis, was the first thing in our marriage that gave me power. Not power to destroy. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. I wanted balance. And above all, I wanted to be seen. When Marcus returned later that evening, flushed from wine and praise, he kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. "How's my girl?" he asked, like I wasn't bruised beneath the sleeves of my blouse, like he hadn't stood at the top of those stairs watching me fall. I smiled and said, "Fine," and I meant it. Because now I knew something he didn't. And for once, I wasn't the one in the dark. It's astonishing how easy it is to hide pain when you've been doing it for years. I moved through the house like nothing had changed, like the fall had never happened, like the letter didn't exist. Marcus went back to his routines, morning coffee at precisely 8, conference calls that bled into early afternoon, dinner with his phone always within reach. He never noticed the stiffness in my steps or the way I flinched when reaching too high. He never asked. He never had. The bruise on my collarbone deepened into something almost black, and I began wearing scarves again, though the summer heat made it nearly unbearable. Marcus didn't comment. He never really noticed what I wore unless it was for a dinner event he needed to parade me through. I'd long stopped asking why. That question, why, had become irrelevant. I wasn't trying to understand him anymore. I was simply observing. Each night I went into the bathroom with a quiet ritual. Ice, ointment, soft stretches against the cold porcelain of the tub. And each night I thought about the letter. I had memorized every word. The tumor's location, the urgency of early treatment, the statistical outcomes. Marcus had no idea that the very thing growing inside him was giving me clarity. Not joy, not satisfaction, but clarity. He had always made me feel powerless, as though everything I owned, everything I had worked for, was only real because he allowed it to be. But the letter reminded me that time wasn't on his side. And that time was finally listening to me. I found myself waking earlier than usual, quietly moving through the house while the sun was still a suggestion on the horizon. I sat in the sunroom, the one Marcus always mocked as your little sanctuary, sipping tea and journaling like I used to before I met him. I wrote down everything: the push, the fall, the pain, the envelope, the decision. For years I had stopped writing, stopped speaking, even stopped thinking in full color. Marcus had reduced my world to muted shades, grays and beiges, expectations and routines. But now, the colors were creeping back in, slowly, defiantly. That week, I also began looking through the household accounts again. Not from fear this time, but curiosity. I opened drawers he thought I never touched. I logged into old joint bank portals and traced the slow siphoning of my money over the past 2 years. Transfers labeled maintenance and consulting had bled my account dry. My savings hadn't vanished. They had been stolen, strategically, quietly. He thought I would never notice. He thought I would never dare ask. I laughed, softly, but it felt real. That laughter startled me. Marcus passed by the room just then, pausing briefly in the doorway. "What's so funny?" he asked, voice neutral but eyes narrowed. "Just something I remembered," I said, closing the laptop. He shrugged and moved on. I kept smiling. He didn't realize I was starting to remember who I was. I found the second envelope a few days later, tucked between a stack of unopened mail and last month's water bill. It was thinner than the first, but the return address was the same: St. Joseph's Oncology. This time, it was marked second notice in red across the top. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, the sunlight slanting through the blinds, striping my bare feet with light and shadow. Marcus had once told me he hated clutter, but it was ironic how he always let the unopened letters pile up like fallen leaves. I held the envelope gently, like it might burn or break, then walked it back to the guest room and placed it in the same shoebox where the first one lay in silence. A little grave of truths, buried for now. That night, he was unusually cheerful. He made pasta, poured wine, and even lit the candles I usually had to remind him existed. "I've been thinking we should go away," he said, swirling his glass with a glint of false warmth. "Take a break from everything. You've seemed tense lately." I tilted my head at him, curious. "Tense?" I asked lightly, watching his face. "Maybe just tired." He shrugged, already bored with the thought. "A weekend in Napa or something. I'll have my assistant book it." He never asked if I wanted to go. That was Marcus's version of romance. A decision delivered, not a question posed. I nodded, letting him think he'd rescued us from some imaginary problem he'd never seen, but somehow solved. I toasted with him, swallowed my wine, and told myself to wait. Just a little longer. Later, after he fell asleep in the recliner with the TV humming nonsense, I retrieved both envelopes and reread them under the pale lamp in the guest room. His condition was not stable. It was worsening. The urgency was underlined in the physician's note. Still, Marcus remained clueless, too proud or too arrogant to realize that missing appointments and ignoring letters wouldn't make cancer disappear. But it wasn't my job to remind him. He had taken something from me the moment he shoved me down those stairs. Not just the money, not just my safety, something more private. My dignity, my place in this house, my right to be heard. But what he didn't know, what he had never taken the time to understand, was that I was a quiet woman, not a weak one. I had been watching, remembering, and now repositioning myself. And he had no idea. The weekend trip never happened. Marcus got too busy with work, and I didn't press it. He had started coughing. Not violently, just enough to catch his attention now and then. He waved it off, claiming it was dust from the attic. But I knew better. I had read the reports, every last line. And when I heard him coughing again that night, alone in his study, I didn't rush in. I simply listened. The cough got worse. It started slipping into conversations, interrupting his sentences with rough, uncontrolled spasms that left him red-faced and irritated. He blamed the air conditioning, then allergies, then the cheap wine at a client dinner. Anything but what it really was. Marcus had always been the kind of man who refused to admit pain, even when it limped beside him like a shadow. Illness to him was weakness. And weakness was something he never tolerated, especially not in others, and certainly not in himself. He didn't know that I was watching him, not just with eyes, but with memory. Noting how long he took to catch his breath after the stairs. How many pills he took from the bottle he kept hidden behind the whiskey decanter. How often he sat down slowly, as if gravity had become heavier on just his body. He thought I was oblivious, that I was too soft, too dim, too broken to notice the cracks beginning to show. But I had seen every fracture, and I had once been married to a man who died slowly. I knew the signs. One afternoon, as he lay down for a nap, I stepped into his study and opened the desk drawer he always locked, but never remembered to check twice. Inside were stacks of letters, business contracts, and 2 yellow prescription bags, both unopened. The names matched the treatment plan I had read in the oncology report. One of the prescriptions was dated 3 weeks ago. He had never started it. I sat down in his chair and looked around the room. The rich mahogany desk, the framed diplomas, the oil painting of a ship crashing through waves. Everything in this space screamed control. But none of it could save him now. He was losing to something he couldn't dominate, and he was too proud to face it. I put everything back exactly as I found it, wiped the drawer handle, and left quietly. That night, I made him tea. Chamomile with honey, the kind he always refused, but drank when he thought it might win him sympathy. He smiled faintly, coughing into his sleeve. "You're being sweet," he said, surprised. "You must want something." I sat across from him and stirred my own tea slowly. "No," I replied. "I just thought you could use something warm." He grunted a thank you and sipped, unaware that I had counted how many times he coughed in the last hour. Unaware that I had memorized the dosage on the unopened medication. Unaware that I had tucked his unopened cancer reports behind old photo albums in the linen closet. Let him pretend. Let him sit in this house surrounded by the illusion of health and order and believe that the world was still under his thumb. Let him think I was still afraid. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that I was finally done pretending. The air in the house had started to change, not in temperature, but in texture. It was heavier now, denser, like the silence between us had taken on weight. Marcus moved slower, each step a little more deliberate, though he still refused to acknowledge what his body was screaming. He spent more time at home, less at the office, claiming he was delegating more. I didn't challenge it. I simply nodded and made sure his coffee was just the way he liked it. Strong, bitter, and untouched by sugar, like him. He had no idea I'd stopped refilling his medication drawer. The bottles sat unopened in the back of the study, right where he left them. I didn't throw them out. I just watched them collect dust. There was no malice in it, at least not the kind that felt good. There was no satisfaction in his coughs or the fatigue etched beneath his eyes. I didn't want him to suffer. I just wanted him to understand what silence felt like, what it meant to need something so badly and be met with nothing. He came into the kitchen one morning looking pale, lips dry, movements sluggish. I was kneading dough, sleeves rolled up, flour across my wrist like a smear of chalk. He sat down at the table without speaking. I offered him water. He waved it off. "I've been tired lately," he muttered, eyes not meeting mine. I didn't answer. I let the silence sit between us, thick and loaded. After a beat, he added, "Might be stress." "Probably," I said, shaping the dough. "You have a lot on your mind." He nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something he didn't fully understand. "You're not mad at me anymore?" he asked, watching my hands work the dough. I looked up, pausing. "Why would I be mad?" His brow furrowed slightly. "I don't know. You've just been quiet." I wiped my hands on the towel and met his eyes. "I've just been thinking." That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Marcus didn't know what to do with introspection that didn't include him. He always assumed that silence meant surrender. But this silence was a fortress, and he couldn't breach it. He stood up too fast and staggered slightly. I didn't rush to help. He steadied himself against the table, hand white-knuckling the edge. "Maybe I should see someone," he murmured. I raised an eyebrow. "Like a therapist?" "No," he snapped, then winced. "A doctor." I nodded. That might be wise. He left the room a moment later, and I returned to the dough, rolling it gently, pressing the air out. He didn't know I had already read the diagnosis. He didn't know the appointments he was just now considering had been missed weeks ago. And he didn't know that the woman standing in his kitchen had already made peace with the truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. He never went to the doctor. Not that week, not the next. He mentioned it once, in passing, as though saying the words aloud fulfilled the responsibility. But Marcus had a way of dancing with denial until reality gave up trying. Instead, he poured himself another drink each evening, grimaced through the coughing fits, and told himself it was just fatigue. He'd never been a man who believed in consequences. Rules were for other people. Limits were for the weak. His body, like everything else, was supposed to obey. Meanwhile, I kept moving through the house like a ghost with a pulse. Present, polite, efficient. I cooked his meals, laid out his vitamins, folded his laundry with hands that had once shaken. But I was not the same woman who had tumbled down the stairs. Something inside me had hardened, not into cruelty, but into resolve. One evening, I was in the garden clipping lavender when I saw him through the living room window, doubled over with his hand on the mantel. He stayed there for a full minute, unmoving, like he was negotiating with his own bones. Then he straightened slowly, shook his head, and poured himself another scotch. I didn't go inside. I let the breeze carry the scent of lavender around me, breathing in peace while he swallowed pride. Later that night, I stood outside the study door and listened as he made a phone call. His voice was low, gravelly, but urgent. "I need an appointment," he said. "Soon. As soon as you can." A pause. "No, I don't have the paperwork. I think my wife might have tossed it." I didn't move. My hands stayed at my sides, calm. Another pause. "Yes, I'll come in. Tomorrow." It wasn't guilt that tightened in my chest. It was something more complicated. I hadn't tossed anything. I had simply hidden the truth in plain sight. In a house full of secrets, I had just added one more. The next morning, he came downstairs in a suit he hadn't worn in months. His face was pale, but his expression was sharp with performance. He didn't say where he was going. I didn't ask. I packed him a lunch and placed it in his hands like it was any other day. "Thank you," he said, surprised. "You'll need the energy," I replied softly. He hesitated, eyes searching mine. For a moment, I thought he might ask. But he didn't. He walked out the front door and into the waiting truth. I returned to the guest room, opened the shoebox, and removed the letters. I stared at the pages he had never read until now, then folded them back with care. He was finally going to hear what I'd known for weeks. But he wasn't the only one preparing. Because when he came back, the conversation we'd been avoiding wouldn't be postponed again. This time, I would speak, and he would listen. He returned just after noon. I heard the garage door stutter open, the engine cut off, the slow crunch of his shoes on the gravel path. But what I noticed most was the absence of sound when he came inside. No heavy footsteps, no clearing of his throat to signal presence. Just the soft creak of the front door, and then nothing. I was in the sitting room, folding linens with the windows open, pretending not to listen for the moment I knew was coming. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he looked older. Not by a year or two, by decades. The color had drained from his face, the sharpness from his eyes. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of something that, for the first time in his life, he couldn't negotiate with. "They confirmed it," he said, his voice thin. "It's cancer." I folded the last towel carefully, aligning the corners like I always did, and set it on the stack. Then I looked up at him. He was waiting, for sympathy, for outrage, for something to fill the silence. But I gave him what he gave me so many times before. Pause. "I know," I said finally. The words hung between us, still and heavy. He blinked. "What?" "I know," I repeated more evenly this time. "I read the report, weeks ago. It came in the mail. You opened my—" His voice broke, half in disbelief, half in exhaustion. "You knew? And you didn't say anything?" I stood then, walking slowly toward him, not in anger, but in clarity. "You pushed me down the stairs when I asked about my own savings," I said softly. "You let me lie there without calling for help. You watched me limp for days and said nothing. So no, Marcus, I didn't tell you. Because silence is something you've taught me well." His mouth opened, but no words came. "I've spent the last 3 years watching you twist love into leverage," I continued. "You controlled everything, finances, decisions, even my voice. But you never bothered to listen. So I decided to stop speaking." He looked at me, and for the first time, there was something like fear in his eyes. "This wasn't revenge," I said, stepping past him. "It was a mirror. I wanted you to feel what I've felt. The uncertainty, the helplessness, the quiet dread." He sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling slightly. "I'm scared," he whispered. I paused at the doorway. So was I. And then I left him there, surrounded by all the things he'd once used to define himself. The polished floors, the curated art, the heavy silence. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Because in that moment, he finally understood that the woman he'd underestimated, the one he tried to silence, had found her voice. And she wasn't afraid to use it anymore. He stayed in that chair for hours. I walked past him twice, once to water the orchids and once to retrieve my book from the windowsill. But he didn't move. His eyes were unfocused, not on anything in particular. Not on the fireplace or the photo of his parents above the mantel. Just fixed in the middle distance, like he was staring down a hallway only he could see. I didn't interrupt his thoughts. I had waited in silence for too long to be disturbed by his. Let him sit with it. Around 5, I made tea. I didn't ask if he wanted any. I simply brewed 2 cups and placed one in front of him, the same way I used to before I stopped trying to be noticed. He didn't thank me. He didn't touch it. But I saw his eyes flicker toward the rising steam, like it reminded him he still existed. By evening, he spoke. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, still not looking at me. I took my time answering, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted him to feel the weight. "That depends on you," I said at last. He turned then, finally meeting my gaze. There was something almost childlike in his expression. Raw, stripped of the armor he always wore. "Do you want me to leave?" It was strange, hearing that question from a man who had spent so long making me feel like a guest in my own home. "I don't want anything from you," I replied. "Not anymore." He looked down, nodding slowly, as if he knew it was deserved. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was thick with consequence. Later that night, as I read by the lamp in the guest room, I heard him moving upstairs. Drawers opening and closing, footsteps soft but hurried. Then silence again. I imagined him digging through papers, retracing steps, trying to undo a string of neglect with last-minute concern. I didn't go to him. Instead, I opened my journal and wrote one line. "The truth makes everyone quiet eventually." The next morning, Marcus appeared in the kitchen dressed in yesterday's clothes, his face unshaven, his voice hoarse. "I've scheduled the treatments," he said. "They start next week." I nodded. "I want you there," he added, a little too quickly. "At the hospital. With me." I looked at him, measured and calm. "I was there when you needed someone most," I said, "and you pushed me away." He winced. "I'll think about it," I added. "But don't ask me for something you never gave." He stood there a moment longer, waiting for forgiveness that hadn't been offered. Then he turned and walked out, shoulders lower than I'd ever seen. And I sat with my tea, letting it steep a little longer than usual, because I finally could. Because I finally mattered. To myself. The house grew even quieter in the days that followed, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the oppressive stillness I had known during the worst of it. Not the kind where you hold your breath because you're afraid the wrong word might crack the air. This silence was more like a clearing after a storm. Still damp. Still heavy. But calm. Marcus walked softer now. His voice was lower. And he didn't try to fill the silence like he used to, with opinions or instructions or reminders of who he thought he was. He sat in his own stillness and let it settle around him. I didn't try to break it. I began moving through my days with more certainty. I went for morning walks, left the house without asking, came home with flowers just for me. I used to wait for his approval before I made the smallest decisions, not because he demanded it, but because he'd conditioned me to expect consequences. But something had shifted in the air between us. He wasn't the man who pushed me down the stairs anymore. And I wasn't the woman who accepted silence as safety. One afternoon, I was arranging lilies in the dining room when he came in holding a manila folder. His eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from living in denial too long. "I talked to my attorney," he said quietly. "I didn't stop arranging the flowers." "Is that so?" "I made changes to the will. You're listed as sole beneficiary." I blinked slowly, then turned to him. "And why are you telling me this now?" He hesitated. "Because you deserve to know. Because I was wrong. About a lot of things." I stared at him, unsure whether I felt gratitude or nothing at all. 3 years ago, I might have cried. I might have thanked him for finally seeing me. But now, all I could think was how late it all was. How after everything, after the lies, the missing money, the push that left me bruised for weeks, his attempt at redemption felt like an afterthought. "I never needed your money, Marcus," I said. "That was never the point." He nodded. "I know that now." I looked down at the lilies, white and fragrant, and gently turned the vase. "And what if I told you I have more than enough of my own?" His head tilted slightly. "What do you mean?" I met his eyes. "I mean you're not the only one who's been keeping secrets." He didn't speak, just stared. And in that moment, I saw a flicker of the old Marcus, the one who always needed to know everything first. But this time, he held his tongue. Some truths, I said, are best saved for when the person is finally ready to hear them. He didn't ask again, and I didn't explain. Because this chapter of us wasn't about confession. It was about control, and how I'd finally taken mine back. He didn't ask that night, or the next. For a man like Marcus, silence was usually a strategy, a tool he used to provoke, to punish, to create unease. But now his silence had a different shape. It wasn't the kind that sought power. It was the kind that tasted like surrender. I could feel the weight of it even when we weren't in the same room. The way he lingered longer in doorways. The way his eyes searched mine as if trying to read an unfamiliar script. And the way he looked at me now. Not like something he possessed, but something he'd misjudged and maybe never understood at all. I didn't offer him answers. Not yet. Instead, I started spending more time in the library, the room he never entered. It had become mine again. I dusted the shelves, reopened journals I'd hidden in drawers, pulled down books I hadn't touched in years. I lit candles in the evening and read until the sky darkened. Sometimes I played music, soft jazz, old piano pieces, notes that filled the corners of the house like breath after a long suffocation. One evening, I found myself opening the small chest I kept locked beneath the desk. Inside were folders, old bank statements, property deeds, trust documents all bearing my name. Not his, not ours, mine. They told the story of a woman he never met, a woman who'd once built something before she was ever Mrs. Marcus Whitmore. A woman who had not only survived loss, but expanded through it. Wealth that was quiet, strategic, and private. He had always assumed I came to him with need. He had never imagined I came to him with options. I pulled out a copy of the trust I had set up years ago. The details were intricate, protected, carefully managed. I ran my fingers along the thick paper and wondered how many times he'd sat across from me, warning me of how complicated finances could be, thinking he was educating me when I had quietly surpassed him long ago. That night, over dinner, he tried again. He didn't ask directly, but I saw the way he kept glancing at me, waiting for an opening, hoping I might pick up the thread he had left dangling days before. When I didn't, he finally spoke. "Elise," he said gently, "do you love me?" The question was so sudden it landed like a dropped glass. I set my fork down and looked at him. I did. His face fell slightly. And now? I took a breath. Now I love myself more. He didn't reply, and I didn't need him to. Because love isn't a debt owed, and mine was no longer something he could withdraw from without notice. He had pushed me down a flight of stairs and called it an accident. But I had risen with more than bruises. I had risen with clarity. And now he was the one left wondering what I might do next. He didn't sleep in our bed that night. I heard him pacing downstairs well past midnight, the rhythm of his footsteps uneven like his thoughts. Every so often, the floorboards would creak under his weight, then fall silent for long stretches. I imagined him standing in the dark kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, the other cradling a glass he'd forgotten to drink from. I didn't go to him, not because I was punishing him, because I no longer felt responsible for his storms. When I woke the next morning, the guest bedroom smelled of lavender and paper. The documents I had taken out the night before still sat on the desk, neatly arranged. The trust, the property records, the private investments he never knew existed. I stared at them a long while, wondering when the time would come to show him. Not for revenge, but for understanding. Not because I wanted to gloat, but because I wanted him to see the version of me he had so carefully ignored. Downstairs he was already dressed. Shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face pale and tired but alert. He was holding a mug of coffee with both hands like he needed it to stay upright. "You didn't come down last night," he said without looking at me. I didn't think I needed to, I replied. He nodded. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I lied, though I had slept better than I had in months. He set the mug down slowly. I've been thinking about what you said, about how you used to love me, about how you love yourself more now. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept talking. I don't blame you. I watched him, unsure of where this was going. I want to change things, he said. Really, not just legally. I want to repair what I broke. You can't unpush someone down the stairs, I said gently, but firmly. His face flinched like I'd struck him. I know, but maybe I can keep you from ever feeling like you need to hide again. From me or anyone. The irony made me pause. I had been hiding because he taught me how. With every withheld truth, every passive dismissal, every moment he treated me like a dependent instead of a partner. What are you really asking, Marcus? I asked softly. He looked up. I'm asking you to stay. I didn't answer right away. I walked over to the window and opened it. The morning air was cool and bright. Birds chirped like nothing had ever gone wrong. I turned back to him. If I stay, it will be on my terms. No secrets, no silence, no control. Can you live with that? His jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. I can try. I believed him, for the first time. But trying wouldn't be enough this time. And I still had one final truth he hadn't earned the right to hear. Not yet. For the next few days, he hovered. Not in an overbearing way, not with the usual arrogance disguised as attentiveness. This was different. Softer. Hesitant. He would pass by the room I was in, linger for a second too long, and keep moving if I didn't speak. He would make small offerings, a cup of tea, a quiet, "How was your walk?" as if testing how far the line of decency could stretch before it snapped. I didn't push him away, but I didn't pull him close either. I watched. I listened. I waited. Something in him had shifted. He was trying. That much was true. But trying was just the first thread. Trust was the fabric. And we weren't sewn back together yet. One evening, as I was shelving books in the library, he stepped inside. His presence used to feel like a disruption. Now, it felt like a question waiting for permission. I gave a small nod, and he stepped in fully, hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets. I've been reading those articles you printed, he said, glancing at the stack on the table. The ones about treatment, about what to expect. I didn't respond. I wanted to know where he was going with this. I'm scared, he admitted quietly. Not just about the cancer, about everything, about what I've done, who I've become. He looked at me like he was waiting to be punished. But I wasn't here to punish. I had already taken what I needed. My peace. You don't get to rewrite the past, I said, placing a book back on the shelf. But you do get to decide what you carry into the future. He took a deep breath and pulled a folder from under his arm. This is for you, he said, placing it on the desk. Everything. Full access. Financials. Passwords. I even wrote a letter to my attorney making it clear you're in charge if anything happens. I didn't touch it. That should have been true from the beginning, I said softly. I know. I studied him for a moment. The looseness in his shoulders. The way his voice no longer tried to dominate a room. And for the first time, I saw him not as the man who hurt me, but as a man standing in the ruins of what he built, finally realizing the cost. Thank you, I said at last, though the words carried more weight than they sounded. He nodded, relief visible. When he left the room, I opened the folder. Everything was there, transparent, accountable, vulnerable. The power I'd once begged for now sat in my hands, given freely, without condition. But I still hadn't shown him mine, my empire, my history, my name before his. Because some truths are not withheld out of vengeance. Some are reserved for the moment when silence is no longer a shield, but an offering. And I was almost ready to lay mine on the table. The morning I decided to tell him, the sky was silver. Not rainy, not bright, just muted, as if the world had agreed to hold its breath with me. I set the table for two, something I hadn't done in weeks. Fresh coffee, toast with marmalade, poached eggs the way he liked them before the illness dulled his appetite. It was a quiet peace offering, one that came not from guilt, but from readiness. I had waited long enough. And now, the silence I had used to protect myself was becoming something else. A wall I no longer needed. He entered the kitchen looking older than usual. The weight loss had become more noticeable in his face. His collar hung slightly looser around his neck, but his posture had steadied. He paused at the doorway when he saw the table. Then he met my eyes. "Special occasion?" he asked, voice tentative. "In a way," I said, pulling out the chair across from mine. We sat without speaking for a few minutes, the clinking of cutlery against ceramic the only sound between us. He took a sip of coffee, eyes still watching me, waiting for the part he could sense but hadn't been invited into yet. "I want to tell you something," I said finally. He set down his fork, hands folding in his lap. "All right. My name wasn't always Whitmore. Before you, I was Elise Kavanaugh." I watched his face, saw the faint tug of recognition. "Kavanaugh," he repeated slowly. "The shipping family?" I nodded. "My father founded the company. I took it over after he died. I've been running it quietly since before we met." He didn't speak, but I saw the color drain slightly from his face. Not from anger, not from betrayal, from disbelief. It was like watching a man discover a new wing of his own home. "I never told you," I continued, "not to deceive you. But because after my first husband died, I was hunted. Not for love, for leverage. People wanted the company, the name, the access. When I met you, and you didn't recognize me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt safe." He exhaled, slow and careful. "I had no idea." "I know," I said. "That's why it worked." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "So all this time, I thought I was the one with control." "You weren't," I said gently. "But I let you believe you were." His face crumpled just slightly, not in shame, in awe. "I married a woman I didn't know," he whispered. "And I married a man I hoped would see me." The silence that followed didn't ache like it used to. It stretched, open and honest. And in that space, for the first time, we both finally saw each other clearly. No masks, no games, just truth, and the fragile, tentative beginning of something real. He didn't speak for a long time after that. We finished breakfast in silence, not the heavy kind that used to fill the space between us like fog, but the kind that asked to be respected. He seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in posture, in presence. Like a man sitting inside his own unraveling, unsure what to do with the threads. And I let him sit there. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't soften the truth. I had carried the weight of silence for 3 years. He could carry a few minutes of revelation. Later, I found him in the garden, where he rarely went unless I was tending to it. He was seated on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, the same place I had once knelt to pull weeds while he stood at the window, sipping scotch and critiquing my posture. Now he was hunched over, elbows on knees, staring at the soil like it had betrayed him. "I never asked about your past," he said as I approached. "Not really. I just assumed you had nothing to hide. You never asked because you thought you already knew, I said. He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I thought you were lucky to be with me, he replied. I didn't flinch. And I thought you'd never see me, I said. A bitter smile appeared on the edge of his lips. I used to believe love was about providing, protecting, controlling the chaos. I shook my head. I thought love meant making myself small enough to be safe. He nodded slowly, as if he was still trying to understand my words. All this time, he whispered, you had more power than I did. No, I corrected him. I had more choice. That's not the same thing. His eyes met mine again, something flickering deep inside. Maybe regret, maybe admiration. Why didn't you leave? He asked. I wanted to, I admitted, many times. But I stayed because I needed to understand something. I needed to know if your cruelty was who you were or who you were taught to be. He stared at the garden wall, his hands clasped tightly. And do you know now? I sat beside him, folding my hands in my lap. I think you learned control as a survival skill, I said. But somewhere along the way, you confused love with ownership. When I wouldn't be owned, you pushed harder. His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. And now? He asked. Now, I said quietly, you're learning. Slowly. Finally. He reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. His grip was careful, not possessive. He held it like something borrowed, not taken. He said, I don't deserve you. I replied, I'm not here for what you deserve. I told him I was here because I finally had nothing left to hide. For the first time since our marriage began, the truth was between us like an uninvited guest at the table, but we welcomed it. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. After that, he started asking questions. Not the kind meant to interrogate or reclaim control, but the quiet kind, the human kind. Late at night, when the house had folded into itself and the air felt thinner, he'd ask about my father. What kind of man he was. What it was like to grow up surrounded by power that never had to shout to be felt. He asked about my first husband, how we met, how we loved, how we said goodbye. And he asked about me, the real me. Not the woman who ironed his shirts and smiled through dinner parties, but the one who'd once stood in boardrooms filled with men twice her age and told them what to do with their money. I answered slowly at first, unsure whether he wanted truth or simply the idea of it. But he listened, truly listened, not with interruptions or judgments or carefully veiled suggestions, just silence and breath and stillness, the kind I had begged for without words for years. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching the sky bleed into itself, he turned to me and asked the question I'd been waiting for. Do you think I ever really loved you? The air around us stopped. I looked at him, the man who had once reduced me to a shadow in my own life, and I didn't rush my reply. I think you loved what I gave you, I said. The calm, the comfort, the illusion of being needed. He didn't interrupt, just nodded, slowly, painfully. But love, I continued, real love, sees. It doesn't assume, it doesn't take without asking, and it doesn't push someone down a staircase and call it an argument. His eyes closed at that, as if the memory still pressed against his chest like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. He whispered, I'm sorry for everything. I replied, I know. A long silence stretched between us, but unlike before, it didn't hurt. Instead, it felt calm and open. After some time, he asked quietly, Is there any part of you that still loves me? I looked out at the garden, at the roses I'd coaxed back to life after his neglect nearly killed them. I thought of the versions of myself I'd buried here. The woman who begged quietly. The woman who lied to herself to make peace. The woman who hid bruises beneath scarves and silence. I don't know if love is the word anymore, I said honestly. But I care. And I'm here. Not out of fear. Not out of obligation. But because I want to see what you do with what's left of yourself. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He just sat beside me, hands folded, eyes open, listening. And for once, that was enough. Because some endings aren't about leaving. Some are about staying for the right reasons. And finally knowing what those reasons are. The treatments began the following Monday. He didn't ask me to go with him again. He didn't need to. I was already by the door when he stepped into the foyer, jacket in hand, face pale but determined. We drove in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something closer to reverent. Like we both understood that whatever happened next would demand more of us than any argument or apology ever could. At the clinic, he signed his name with a shaky hand. I watched from the waiting room, the scent of antiseptic and quiet grief thick in the air. Couples sat beside each other, hands clasped tightly. Some alone. Some laughing too loudly to mask fear. And there we were. Two people who had once existed in the same house like strangers now finding a fragile rhythm in shared breath and shared time. When the nurse called his name, he stood slowly. I stood too. He looked at me then, a brief glance, unsure if I meant to follow. I nodded once, and that was enough. He didn't reach for my hand. I didn't offer it. But we walked side by side. The treatment room was cold, sterile, humming with machines. I sat in the chair beside his and watched as they inserted the IV. His jaw clenched, but he didn't complain. For a man who once barked about lukewarm coffee, this silence was something sacred. Hours passed. I read a book I couldn't focus on. He dozed off for stretches, waking in spurts with a furrowed brow, eyes darting to make sure I was still there. I always was. At one point, as the drip continued, he opened his eyes and whispered, "You don't owe me this." I closed the book. I know. Then why are you here? I looked at him, really looked. The man who had once broken me, now unraveling in his own way. Thinner, quieter, human. Because showing up doesn't mean I've forgotten, I said. It means I've decided not to abandon what's still alive. He stared at the ceiling after that, eyes wet but unblinking. When the treatment ended, I helped him into his coat. We walked out into the sunlight, brighter than either of us expected. He winced at the light. I steadied him. The breeze smelled like the promise of something new. In the car, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. A picture of us from the first year of our marriage. Before the bruises. Before the lies. Before the silence. He said, "I keep it with me to remember what I almost ruined." I took the photo and looked at it carefully. Then I folded it gently and placed it in the glove compartment. I told him, "Then stop remembering it. Start earning it." He nodded. As we pulled out of the parking lot, the road ahead didn't feel like a sentence anymore. It felt like a beginning. Hard and uneven, but ours. The side effects came quickly. By the end of the week, Marcus couldn't hold down his meals. The nausea curled him inward, shrinking a man who had once filled every room with his voice into someone smaller, quieter, and far less certain. His skin turned a chalky gray. The sharp angles of his face grew sharper. He slept more, spoke less. Sometimes he would forget where he left his phone or what day it was. But he always remembered to look for me. It was strange, caring for the man who had once made me afraid to breathe too loudly. The man who had taken my name and reshaped it into a whisper. Now, I was spooning broth to his lips, rubbing circles into his back when the vomiting took over. changing the sheets in the middle of the night when the sweat soaked through. Not because I had to, because I could. And because somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking to be served and started learning how to receive. He apologized constantly for the smell, for the mess, for the years before the illness. "You don't have to keep saying it," I told him once as I rinsed out a washcloth. "I know." "But I want to," he replied, voice brittle. "You need to hear it as many times as I need to say it." And I did. One afternoon, he called me into the study. He'd been going through some old files, boxes stacked neatly in the corner. He held up a framed photo I hadn't seen in years. Me, at a charity gala, before him. My hair longer, my smile wider. "I saw this online after we got married," he said, tracing the glass. "Someone sent it to me anonymously. I remember looking at it and feeling threatened." "By a photograph?" I asked gently. He corrected me, saying it was by the woman in it. She looked like she didn't need anyone, and he needed to feel needed. I stayed silent and waited. He went on to say that he spent years trying to shrink me into something manageable. Not because I wasn't enough, but because I was too much for the man he was willing to be. He set the photo down beside him and said he thought he was finally ready to meet the woman he married, the real one. I stepped forward, took the photo from the desk, and held it in my hands. I didn't recognize her anymore, not entirely, but I remembered her. She had survived things this version of Marcus would never understand. And now, she was watching from the frame, still standing tall. "You already have," I told him quietly. And for the first time, he didn't look away. He nodded, eyes glassy, and reached for my hand, not to claim it, not to control it, but just to hold it, like someone who finally knew the difference. I didn't plan to stay. Not after the fall, not after the silence, not after the bruise that bloomed across my back like a warning. I had packed my truth into quiet corners and prepared myself to leave the way women like me always do, softly, without a mess, with nothing but a suitcase full of self-respect. But something happened on the way to goodbye. He broke. Not in the way that shatters, but in the way that bends. Slowly. Painfully. And in that breaking, he found something neither of us expected. Humility. I didn't stay because he got sick. I stayed because he finally saw me. Not the woman he thought he saved. Not the version he tried to sculpt into compliance. But the one who had been there all along. Whole. Silent. Watching. He never got back everything he lost. Some things were gone for good. But he learned how to ask instead of assume. How to listen instead of speak. And how to love without ownership. And me? I remembered my name. Not the one he gave me. The one I never stopped carrying, even when I went quiet. And now, I speak it every day. Out loud. With peace. And without apology. Thank you for watching. Her story is one of survival, truth, and finally choosing herself. To hear more stories like this, click on the left, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You are not alone in what you've lived.